In the early 1900s, the golden age of exploration was coming to an end. Every corner of the world had largely been visited, conquered, and claimed by a few countries that were intent on owning everything. However, that need to explore, to discover, to be the first, was still a burning ember in many adventurous souls. But was there anywhere left that needed a good exploring? Just one place. And seriously, you have to really want to explore to go to the most inhospitable place on Earth. Of course, I'm talking about Antarctica. At the time, the sexy legend-securing challenge was to be the first to reach the South Pole. But which South Pole? There are two. In 1907, famous explorer Ernest Shackleton led an exploration to the geographic South Pole. He didn't make it, but his expedition was the first to summit Mount Erebus, and they did make it to the magnetic South Pole. And those are two pretty snazzy patches to put on your explorer sash. While it does vary, the distance between the magnetic and the geographic South Poles at the time was 1,700 miles. That's the equivalent of walking from Chicago to Los Angeles in these conditions. Shackleton may sound familiar to you since one of his later expeditions aboard the now infamous and recently discovered Endurance had plans to cross the entire Antarctic continent. They became stranded in a crushing ice pack for almost 2 years. The ill-fated ship was literally crushed and shoved to the bottom of the ocean. But, amazingly, everyone survived. So, happy ending? However, that is not the ordeal that I want to share with you today. One of the men in Shackleton's failed expedition to the South Pole was Douglas Mawson. This is his story. In 1912, Mawson was asked to join Robert Falcon Scott in his attempt to reach the geographic South Pole. Mawson declined because he was more interested in leading a scientific expedition to gather information and map the region. So instead, he led the Australasian Antarctic expedition. When they arrived at base camp in Commonwealth Bay, they were met with 50-mile-per-hour winds, often gusting up to 200 miles per hour, and near constant blizzard-like conditions. That's a Category 5 hurricane with blinding snow and far below zero temperatures. Obviously, humans aren't meant to be in this place. Hypothermia and frostbite are virtual certainties. There are no plants nor animals to eat once you leave the shore. No trees to build a shelter, and with the exception of some lichen and hardy microbes, the continent is virtually lifeless. Mawson divided his men into 4 teams. 3 teams would explore different routes, while 1 team stayed at base camp to further advance that facility. Mawson chose Lieutenant Belgrave Ninus, who was the dog handler for the expedition, and Ninus' friend Xavier Mertz, a 28-year-old Swiss lawyer and cross-country ski champion and a never-ending source of great energy. When I say never-ending, I'm getting ahead of myself. Mawson's team was a powerhouse. With 3 sleds and 16 huskies, they covered 300 miles in the first month of travel. I have to stop here for a second to make sure you understand what they were crossing. Sometimes they got smooth ground and perhaps that roaring wind was at their backs. Lovely. Still, snow blindness and debilitating freezing temperatures were kind of like mosquitoes in Louisiana, ever-present, uncomfortable, and inescapable. But the real danger was crossing glaciers. Glacier fields are terrifying. Glaciers are always in motion, slow motion, but enough motion that enormous pressure builds up and can suddenly shift violently, causing the ground to collapse into the abyss. The most immediate danger of glaciers are snow bridges. Imagine a 400-foot crevasse or chasm that has been covered by falling snow. The snow bridge looks exactly like the solid ground you're standing on, but your next step could suddenly have you feeling as if you're skydiving. Back to our story. As you've likely guessed, the luck of this fast-moving crew was about to run out. On December 13th, 1912, yes, of course, the 13th was a Friday the 13th, the team set up camp for the night. Mawson decided to redistribute the supplies and condense everything down to 2 sleds. During the night, the team could hear the distant booms of nearby glaciers. Mertz, the cross-country ski champion, was well aware of the potential dangers. The next day was warmer by the insane standard of Antarctica, and that's not a good thing for ground stability. As Ninus and Mawson drove the sleds, Mertz skied ahead to help navigate any hazards. Mawson looked up and saw that Mertz was holding a ski pole, signaling a crevasse. Mawson turned back to confirm that Ninus had seen the signal. Mawson looked ahead once more, and he could see that Mertz was standing there, clearly distressed about something. Mawson looked back to see that Ninus, his dogs, and the sled were gone. Mawson and Mertz raced back to search for Ninus. They cautiously crawled toward the newly revealed chasm and looked down to see two dogs, one dead and one in agony, on an ice shelf about 150 feet below. Just beyond the ice shelf, a black void that seemed to go into the depths of the earth. The two men called out for Ninus for hours. Eventually, they had no choice but to accept that Ninus was gone. They performed a burial service and began planning their return to base camp. When Ninus fell into the earth, he took virtually all of their food, the tent, and the other supplies with him. A literal death sentence for the two men still alive. Knowing they were at least 4 to 5 weeks from base camp, the two men realized they would only survive by eating their dogs. Mawson wrote in his diary, "May God help us." It won't surprise you to know that things are about to get worse, a lot worse. That night, they made it back to the site where Mawson had decided to abandon one of the sleds. They took it apart and were able to fashion a makeshift shelter. They killed the weakest dog, ate the flesh and liver, and fed the rest to the other dogs. For a few days, the two men were able to move at a pace you might expect from someone racing against death. Their efforts came to a halt when Mawson was struck with a painful bout of snow blindness. Mertz bathed Mawson's eyes with a solution of zinc sulfate and cocaine. While this may sound like a strange attempt, zinc sulfate is an antiseptic with anti-inflammatory benefits, and cocaine is a strong anesthetic as well as a powerful vasoconstrictor that could have provided some pain relief. Either way, things continued to trend downward as the next of the seemingly constant storms slammed the area with a whiteout. I could continue to say, but then things got worse, but that's really going to get redundant. So just assume that if I'm still talking and going on to another topic, then yeah, somehow it's just going from one level of frozen hell to the next increasingly awful level of frozen hell. It's a pattern. With only dog meat on the menu, deficiencies are bound to pop up. On January 5th, 1913, the physical state of Mertz began to deteriorate. Although rot may have been a better word, skin started falling off of his legs. Mertz insisted that a day's rest would give him that boost he so desperately needed. The men decided to hold for 24 hours. It's important to note here that they were racing several clocks at once. Starvation and freezing to death weren't even in the top spot of priority. You see, the Aurora, the ship that would take them home, would be leaving soon. They knew the agreed upon date of departure, February 8th, and they knew the ship would not wait. A day of rest, no matter how urgently needed, was essentially a step closer to death. On January 6th, the day that Mertz wanted to take a day off and rest, Mawson wrote a harrowing entry. Imagine being Mawson, sitting in a small, improvised tent with pencil and paper, wind howling, frostbite coming at you from every angle. His friend and colleague laying next to him, literally decaying, as he writes, "Things are in a most serious state for both of us. If he, Mertz, cannot go 8 to 10 miles a day, in a day or two, we are doomed. I could pull myself through with the provisions at hand, but I cannot leave him. His heart seems to have gone. It is very hard for me. To be within 100 miles of the hut and in such a position is awful." The next morning, the mind of Mertz followed his decaying body as he began having fits of rage. The two men were, against all odds, and I mean all of them, all of the odds, somehow able to get moving again. As they set up their next base camp, Mertz snapped into a bizarre delirium and managed to break a tent pole. At obvious great risk to himself, Mawson grabbed Mertz and held him. Incredibly, this seemed to calm the man. Mawson put Mertz back into his sleeping bag, and around 2 a.m., the tortured Mertz passed away in his sleep. With his energy already dangerously low, Mawson cut out enough blocks of ice to entomb Mertz. He had to move on if he had any hope of surviving. Mawson was now approximately 100 miles from base camp, separated by the most dangerous terrain on Earth, and his own body was starting to decay as his nose and lips began to break open. What drives a man to take the next step, even when the body has already begun to die? For Mawson, it was the thought of his fiancée, Bequita, and the overwhelming need to tell the story of his fallen comrades. Days later, Mawson's feet were hurting so intensely he had to stop and tend to them. He discovered that the soles of his feet had become detached. The soles of his feet were detached from his foot. His entire body was disintegrating. He was covered in blisters, open sores, and suffering from frostbite as his body was telling him in no uncertain terms that he was dying, virtually decomposing. But Mawson somehow refused to accept the message. He wrapped his feet in wire, detached soul and all. I said I wouldn't say this, but if you can believe it, yeah, things are about to get worse. On January 17th, Mawson falls through a snow bridge into a crevasse that, as far as he can tell, has no bottom. Fortunately, he had tied himself to the sled and his body snapped to a sudden stop above the black abyss as he dangled and spun, waiting for the sled to join him in his final fall. But it didn't happen. Yes, he could feel the sled inching toward the edge. He had to make a decision: dangle and die, or try to climb back to the surface. Let me ask you this right now. Could you climb a 15-foot rope, assuming you had a decent night's sleep and a lovely breakfast and are completely healthy? Could you do it? Now put yourself in the bloody, rotting, flesh-filled boots of Douglas Mawson in a state of decay, starvation, hands split open and actively bleeding. Could you do it then? Well, because this man simply refused to die, he somehow poked the Grim Reaper in the eye once more, and after a few failed attempts, miraculously pulled his practically lifeless body to the surface. Now, I know at this point you're probably on the fence with what's best, death or the extension of unimaginable suffering. It had to be a coin flip. Knowing he wasn't the luckiest of men, he spent the night fashioning a rope ladder in case he were to fall into another crevasse, which of course he did the very next day. January is coming to an end, and Mawson can barely manage 4 to 5 miles per day, which really seems like a lot under the circumstances. The departure of the Aurora is getting closer as Mawson's health meter is blinking red with a siren blaring. He has to continually stop to redress his open wounds. His hair is falling out. Each step is another milestone of human endurance. So, of course, an intense blizzard hits. Knowing this will slow him down, he pushes even harder and was able to cover 8 miles before the struggle of building a nightly camp. But the next day brought sunshine and what must have been accompanied by the sound of angels singing. He could make out the coast of Commonwealth Bay. Base camp was only 40 miles away. 40 miles. However, he knew there was a nearby cave named Aladdin's Cave with supplies that was only 30 miles away. He pressed on, and by February 1st, he made it to the shelter of Aladdin's Cave. Here, he was overwhelmed at the sight of oranges and a pineapple that had been left there. Not because they were food or would provide critical vitamins and non-dog calories, but because he was finally able to look at something that wasn't white. Remember, the Aurora is scheduled to leave on February 8th, and Mawson now only has 10 miles to go, so of course, another huge storm hits, forcing him to take shelter in the cave for 5 days. When the storm finally gave way, he embarked on the last leg of his horrific march and made it to base camp just in time to watch the Aurora sail off in the distance. Really, that happened. Yep, just like that. He actually saw the ship sailing away. However, the consolation prize wasn't as bad as it could have been. A small team of men had remained behind to wait for him, believing that there could be survivors. He had to remain in Antarctica for another winter before returning home. Mawson later stated he was grateful for this slow period of recovery and time with this smaller group of men to heal and process all that he had been through. Douglas Mawson had survived a virtually impossible set of circumstances in the most inhospitable terrain on planet Earth, and he set the standard for mental fortitude and the ability to simply move forward, no matter how slowly or painfully, in hopes that those movements may eventually lead to a better day. What about the driving force that kept him going, his lovely Paquita? Well, they were married and lived a long life together, raising 2 daughters. Mawson passed away in 1958. Paquita buried beside her husband in 1974. Well done, Sir Douglas Mawson, and thank you so much for watching.